Good afternoon, and welcome to the second of our Spring Series Writer Series events. I guess you all like us better than tennis, huh? Please turn off your cell phones. Even if you think it's off, will you just check right now and make sure it's off? I appreciate it. Like I told you last week, the videos from this year's festival are all available to view now for free online at either our website or our YouTube channel, which is the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival YouTube channel. So go back and look at ones you might have missed. They're really terrific. Want to thank, as always, our founder and fearless leader, Jamie Kabler. As you all know, the city of Rancho Mirage is our partner in everything to do with the Writers Festival and the Writers Series. So today from the City Council, we have Michael O'Keefe, City Councilman. And we have Steve Downs, City Councilman. And his beautiful wife, Jerry. All of the Writers Series events are underwritten by Jordan Schnitzer, an angel of the Writers Festival and the underwriter of this whole series. So all of you that have a book in your lap, it's thanks to Jordan. So we want to give him a special thank you as well. And in the front couple rows of the audience are our angels. We always want to thank you because without you, we wouldn't have a festival at all. So please, a round of applause for our angels. If you weren't lucky enough to receive a free book on your way in, our bookseller, Follett, Dean, is in the back of the house, and he'll be glad to sell you a copy of the CIA Book Club. After the presentation, we're going to have a signing like always. Charlie will be over there at a table, and if you'll all line up against this wall, we'll get everyone through the line. You can talk to Charlie, tell him your CIA experiences. We happen to have someone in the audience who really has CIA experiences today. So please wait in line, and we'll get you through the line quickly. We have three more Writer Series events coming up this spring. There's one next week, the following week. We skip a week, and then the first week of April. So please look on your emails and come to those as well. Now, we have a special guest today. I told you last week that the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival funds the Western Wind Writing Competition, which is a competition amongst seventh graders all over Palm Springs Unified School District. So every seventh grader has a chance to enter, and we pick a first and second place winner each year in the spring from the submitted entries. All of the subject is always the same. It's overcoming adversity. And so we are lucky enough today to have one of this last year's winners. She's now in 8th grade, but she wrote it when she was in 7th grade. Please help me welcome Natasha Rojas.
The time I won. Have you ever felt how you would be able to win a game? How it felt to hold the trophy and everyone clapping for you? Well, this is the story will be about how I was able to win a tournament on how I won. First, I arrived at the tennis courts with my parents, and I was waiting there until my coach said to partner up. My mom said to me, "You got this, do your best." "I will," I told my mom. I was at the courts warming up, and it was hot, and the sky was blue, and the sun was bright yellow. I was excited to play. I knew it didn't matter if I won or not. It just mattered that I would have fun. "Okay, let's start partnering up with people now," said my coach. We all got partnered up by how good we were. There were 2 sections. A group was the best. I've been playing since I was 7, so I played very well. So, of course, I was in the A group. But my opponents played very well as well. So now we all went to different courts. I was walking to the first court, and my opponent showed up. I was gonna play singles. "Up or down?" I asked. "Down," my opponent said. It landed down, so what side do you want? I asked. I'll have the right side, she said. Okay, do you want to serve or receive? I asked. I'll receive, she said. So I went to my side of the court and I bounced the ball a couple of times and I threw the ball in the air, then swoosh. I served the ball and it landed in the box. Then while I was playing, I hit a very good shot and it went in the whole other side of the court. And my opponent was on the other side of the court. And by the time she ran to the other side, she had missed the tennis ball. Nice shot, my opponent said. Thank you, I said. After that, we decided to get a water break. I was very tired and already wanted to go to my house and shower and sleep. But I still had one more match to play and I had already won the first set. It was 6-5. Okay, it's your turn to serve, I said. Then we switched sides. I was lucky because I got to the side where the sun isn't in my face. Finally, I won to 5-0, but I still needed one more game to win. Love, ready? She said, ready? I said, so we started playing an intense match. We kept having good rallies and we kept hitting it back and forth without a bother. After she hit it high up in the air and I ran towards the ball and swoosh. I slammed the ball and I had won. Good job, I said. You too, my opponent said. We both shook hands and I got our water bottles and walked to the third court to give our scores. After that, we all gathered up. In the B division, first is Alondra, said my coach. My cousin also plays tennis and she has won first place. And finally, at last, my coach announced my name, and everyone was clapping for me and cheering for me, and had a bright gold trophy with first place number on one on top, and it's all shiny. Good job, you did so good, my mom said. Thank you. That's when I knew I started to actually like tennis. I will never forget the first time I won first place. Winning first place in this tournament is the best thing that has happened to me. I've had this trophy for almost 3 years, and now whenever I look at it, my trophy, I feel proud.
Well, from that, it sounds like maybe there's one person that would have rather been at the tennis matches than here. So we'll root for you, Natasha, whether you end up being a tennis star or a budding writer. Either way, we're very proud of you. Now on to today's program. Charlie English is an award-winning journalist and former head of international news at The Guardian. He's built a reputation for uncovering extraordinary, true stories that brings history vividly to life. He's written several books, including The Book Smugglers of Timbuktu, and his newest, The CIA Book Club, which reminds us that books can be more than stories. They can be acts of courage, resilience, and sometimes even quiet rebellion. Speaking with Charlie today is Doug Miller, a true Renaissance man. When not occupied with his day job as a justice of the California Court of Appeals, you can find him teaching Tai Chi at Sunnylands, fly fishing, or perfecting new recipes with me in our kitchen. He's my husband. Please join me in welcoming Charlie English and Justice Doug Miller.
So it's nice to be here. It feels like I haven't been here since the fall. So Charlie, welcome to the desert. I know that you've been to Joshua Tree, Pioneer Town. You're going to drive up the coast. The desert's a wonderful place, I hope you found.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fantastic to be here. We've only been here about 24 hours, but we've covered as many sites as possible. So,
Well, it's a good thing you're not being here next week, because it's going to be, I think, over 100 degrees.
Yeah, I want to get out before the heat really hits.
What was it in London today? Probably 30 degrees?
Well, we work in a different system, so it was really cold and miserable. So I say that.
So I told Jamie this morning that in all the books that he's asked me to interview somebody, this is the very first where when he told me what the name of the book was and told me what it was about, that I knew absolutely nothing about it. But it's a fascinating and intriguing story about a time period in history where some individuals made a huge change, a worldwide change. And before, though, we get to the book, I wanted to comment about your other books because they're all fabulous. And I don't think they have them in the back, but you should buy each and every one of them because they're also intriguing and they're stories, quite frankly, that were obscure that I'd never heard of. The Gallery of Miracles and Madness. It's about Hitler and modern art and mental illness. It's fascinating. The Book Smugglers of Timbuktu, a story about Timbuktu ancient manuscripts and their rescue from the jihadists in 2012. The Storied City, the quest for Timbuktu and the fantastic mission to save its past, which was about modern-day librarians, just like people here, smuggling ancient manuscripts to safety. And then, I don't know where this one came from, but it's called The Snow Tourist, and he explores his obsession with snow.
That's like a holiday read.
All right, so the cover of the book, it's called The CIA Book Club, The Secret Mission to Win the Cold War with Forbidden Literature. Again, something that I didn't know anything about. So how did you discover this? And what inspired you to write a book about the CIA Book Club?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I guess from what as you've just said, I've spent some time writing books about culture in some aspect, and particularly culture in a kind of conflict situation. So the Timbuktu story was about saving this Islamic heritage from Al-Qaeda, effectively. And then a book about how Hitler used art as a kind of way of selling Nazism to the German people. So I was on this kind of cultural in conflict beat, if you like. I'm always looking out for just a story that can be told in a kind of thrilling, Le Carré-esque kind of style, and I came across this story about books being, in fact, it was an obituary of a British philosopher who had, it said in the obituary that this guy, Roger Scruton, had taken books across the Iron Curtain whenever he'd gone into the Eastern Bloc, and he'd asked his students to do the same. And it seemed to me if there was a sort of, organized move to shift literature into the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War, then that would be kind of in my zone, if you like. And then discovering that there was a CIA-led effort, and also that it had a really kind of major impact in the outcome of the Cold War. It just had all my kind of, juices going, if you like, and I started looking into it at that point, yeah.
So before we talk about the book, I'd like to talk about your research, because this is something that happened 50 or 60 years ago. So were you able to access the documents through the CIA?
Well, I rang the CIA, who were not very helpful. They put me onto, I think they have I'm alarmed to know that there might be someone in the CIA in the audience, but it's the first time that's happened to me, or knowingly anyway. So I think they have a sort of media team who help people make those, glamorizing films. But they obviously weren't going to release any documents. But what I did find was the guy who ran the book program, who was a guy called George Minden, who lived in New York. When he died in 2006, his family found in one of his closets a load of documents that he'd kept. And he used to travel to Europe twice a year, every year, to meet all his contacts in this kind of book enterprise that we're going to talk about. And he would make notes from it. And these were they still are in the Hoover archives at Stanford University. So, I started writing this about 3 weeks before COVID, before our first lockdown happened in London. So it was a bit of a kind of tricky time. But I found an undergrad student in Stanford who went to the Hoover, who took pictures of these documents for me and sent them to me in London. And then I had this kind of backbone of a story from these documents, and I could go to Poland, which is where large bits of this story are set, and say to people, I know you met George Minden, who was running the CIA book program on such and such a date.
So you were able to interview people who had been there during the time period.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a kind of an oral history built on these reports that Minden wrote from his European trips.
And were you able to find any declassified CIA documents?
There are a few, yeah. I mean, they dribs and drabs, really. I mean, the way it's worked over the years is people would put in freedom of information requests, and occasionally some single document would come out. But there's just not very much of it. So you have to it's a kind of jigsaw with a lot of the pieces missing. And the book program must have produced hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of documents. And these are all still classified, and they're presumably all still in a big warehouse somewhere. But nobody's going to release them anytime soon.
So I didn't intend to ask you this, but we joked about someone being here from the CIA, and you said something about, maybe they're following you, but did you ever...
I didn't say that. Let's hope not.
But did you ever have that feeling? I mean, you inquired of them, you didn't have a feeling like they were going to monitor you or
I was
spy
interested, and you never know, do you? But I mean, who is it, by the way? But as a journalist, you just have to go about your business as usual, and, if people are watching, so what? It doesn't really change what you do.
Well, but what about us? Is there something you're going to tell us that we have to be worried about? No, I'm kidding. So I want you to take us back to 1950, and we're talking about the Cold War. I was going to tell Jamie too. I learned all about Yalta and the conference at the end of World War II, and here you have all these Eastern Bloc countries that are subsumed by Stalinistic communists. So tell us what it was like in 1950, 1951 in Czechoslovakia and Romania and Poland. What were they subject to? Well,
they'd obviously just come out of this incredibly brutal experience in World War II. I mean, we all our countries suffered, I guess, but really not like they did. And I mean, Poland in particular had, most of the Holocaust happened on Polish soil, and Hitler seemed to have this particular. I mean, he saw Slavic people as Untermensch, as he put it, and razed a lot of these countries to the ground, really. And in Poland, they'd had the Warsaw Uprising, which was the moment when the Poles tried to establish their independence as the Germans kind of retreated. And Stalin's Red Army sat on the other side of the Vistula, which is the main river in Warsaw, and basically waited until the Warsaw Uprising was defeated by the Nazis, and all the Poles were kind of shot or rounded up, and then the Germans retreated, and then the Red Army moved in. So they'd swapped one terrible totalitarian dictatorship for another one, effectively. And what this meant was, certainly in that early period, you had the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, which turned into the KGB, rounding people up, torturing them in jails, assassinating them. There's a sort of notorious jail in Warsaw where people were just killed with a bullet in the back of the head, and they're still finding the graves now, buried around this prison. And in terms of from our purposes, there was also this kind of ideological battle being fought. So the Soviets imposed this system of censorship that they designed after the Russian Revolution. And so every East European country had this censor's office, which was part of the party apparatus, and it made sure that every word and almost every thought in the country was governed by these communist principles. So every newspaper, every radio station, if you wanted to put on a theatre performance or write a book or a newspaper article, or even print a business card, then you had to go through the censor's office.
You couldn't even make a wedding invitation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and later on, all the photocopies and typewriters had to be registered with the state. So the idea was to make sure that nobody could have a thought in public that wasn't pre-approved by the ideology, I guess you could say.
So I want you to read something.
Oh, yeah.
On pages 14 through 15. For two purposes. I want you to hear about what the censorship was like, but I also want you to see the way he writes. I mean, this book is in some sense like a spy thriller, and it's not a typical history book. You wrote it more in a narrative sense, is that right?
Yeah, it's narrative nonfiction. That's the idea.
I mean, it's a history book, but it's almost been written somewhat like a historical fiction book.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say? Because it just flows very easy.
Thank you very much. I think that's a compliment, yeah. Thank you so much.
So if you could read page 14 through 15.
Sure. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. These three double-think slogans are inscribed on the towering Ministry of Truth in Orwell's novel 1984. The ministry is ironically named. Its purpose is not to safeguard the truth, but to destroy it, to edit history to fit the present needs of the party and its leader, Big Brother, since who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Orwell's hero, Winston Smith, comes here each day to work at falsifying the public record, redrafting reports of speeches given and production forecasts made, and airbrushing out politicians who have fallen from favour. After applying his changes, he covers his tracks by throwing his instructions in an incinerator chute known as the memory hole. Every country in the Eastern Bloc had its equivalent of the Ministry of Truth, modelled on the Moscow template, the main directorate on literature and publishing affairs. In Poland, the system of ideological manipulation was one of the most complex in the world. The main office for the control of presentations and public performances occupied the better part of a city block on Mysia Street, opposite the party headquarters in downtown Warsaw. Here, state censors, supervised by the Politburo, worked to align the thoughts of the people with the aims and edicts of the party. The main office reached into all aspects of Polish life. It had sub-branches in every city and region, and employees in every television and radio station, every film and theatre studio, and every publishing house. Every typewriter in Poland had to be registered, access to every photocopier was restricted, and a permit was needed even to buy a ream of paper. If you wanted to create a business card, a rubber stamp, a piece of sheet music, or a theatre programme, you needed approval from the censor. More than merely prohibiting and cutting inconvenient facts and opinions, the main office also instructed the media on which subjects to cover and how to handle them.
Pretty amazing. It's almost hard to believe, isn't it?
These days, I'm not sure it's that hard.
So, so that was a preview, because we'll talk about that at the end. We'll talk about it at the end. So I want to start at the beginning. Tell us about something called the Free Europe Committee and Winds of Freedom.
Sure. So at the end of the Second World War, the communist movement showed signs of taking over the whole of Europe and other parts of the world. And the Western powers, in particular the States, but also the Allies in Europe, were very alarmed by the kind of prospect of this kind of virus of communism as they saw it spreading around the world. So the response of a group of Americans in New York, these included people like the Dulles brothers and Eisenhower, set up an organization called the Free Europe Committee, which was really designed to utilize all the East European immigrants who had fled Stalin's forces and ended up in the West after the war, and who arrived with very little money, kind of no resources, and so on. And the Free Europe Committee's idea was to fund these people and organize them and give them a way of kind of pushing back communism in their own countries, because they were highly motivated to do that. So, yeah, I mean, people probably know about the Free Europe Committee. I mean, it began Radio Free Europe, famously. That's its most kind of famous product, which broadcast in the languages of East European nations across the border. But, radio had its limitations. It was subject to jamming by the Soviets. And the Free Europe Committee was always kind of trying to look for other solutions, other ways to kind of address this problem. So they came up initially with the idea of a balloon program, which is what this Winds of Freedom operation essentially was. It was fronted by a young Ronald Reagan, and it was a CIA operation, as the Free Europe Committee was this kind of CIA cover. And what they did was launch hundreds of thousands of balloons, I think maybe even millions of balloons, into the Eastern Bloc, carrying propaganda messages.
Mostly leaflets.
Mostly leaflets, yeah. So they would kind of drive out to, they'd check the weather, the wind was blowing in the right direction. They'd drive to a spot just in West Germany, just next to the Iron Curtain, and then load these big pallets full of leaflets onto these weather balloon sort of things, and launch them into the air. And the balloons were designed to pop at a certain altitude and then rain down all the leaflets on the people below. So I think some enormous figure like, 300 million leaflets were dropped on Eastern Europe over a 5-year period. And mostly they said very useless things like, we're your friends in the West, we haven't forgotten you. And so people would sort of not hang on to them because there was really no point. They had no value. And the secret police in these countries, if they caught you with them, you were in quite a lot of trouble. So the balloon program was a bit of a failure.
But it aggravated the Soviets. They even launched jets to try to shoot the
they would
balloons
send
down.
up fighter jets to shoot the balloons down. The balloons would cause trouble with air traffic, and the West Germans got annoyed. So, there was a whole sort of politics around it, which meant it wasn't very successful.
And that kind of brings us to George Minden, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So tell us about him, because was he the most compelling and memorable person, in a sense, in the book? Although there were some ones from Poland we're going to talk about. But
yeah, Minden was a very fascinating character. He was in some ways, he was a kind of classic Free Europe Committee hire, in that he was born in Romania. He was forced to leave during the war. Ended up he came to England for a bit, and then
and wasn't he
Mexico.
one of the richest men
That's
in
right.
Europe?
He inherited most of Romania's oil fields when he was 18. So he was very well educated. He got a law degree in Bucharest University, but had to leave all that, leave all his riches behind. And really, I mean, he married an American woman in the around early 1950s, and they moved to New York. She got a job on the New York Times, and he started working his way up the Free Europe Committee and ended up in something called the Press and Special Projects Division. which was the bit that dealt with the book program. And just to fill in a little gap there, the balloon program had been replaced in the late 50s by the book program, because they realized that when they started sending things through the post, so they scrapped the balloons and sent things in the mail, and the CIA would get these phone directories for Eastern Europe, and they would just take names and addresses out of the phone directory and say, right, we're going to send stuff to Joe Bloggs in, wherever. And they realized that when they sent books instead of leaflets, then people wanted to keep the books. And the books had a value in the Eastern Bloc. And sometimes they would write back to whoever, whatever the sender's address was, and say, can we have some more books? And so there was a kind of opportunity there. And Minden was one of the first people to really understand that.
And so kind of tell us what he did. I mean, he had an office in New York on Park Avenue.
Yeah.
He starts to work with the CIA, and it becomes this huge organization.
Yeah, it was on Park Avenue South, 475 Park Avenue South. There's this kind of big tower block there, and they worked. The office was on the 14th floor of this very nondescript block. The organization was called the International Literary Center, which was a kind of cover name for a CIA operation. And Minden pretended that he was a sort of very rich philanthropist who was interested in East European literature. And he had probably a dozen or a couple of dozen employees in this office, and they had different desks for different countries, and books would come in, and they would. Minden liked to kind of check which books they were sending himself, but they had desk editors for each nationality, and then they would draw up target lists of who they wanted to send the material to. And as time went on, it got kind of more and more sophisticated, and as well as sending in the post, they developed a
smuggling program.
A smuggling program, yes.
Tell us about that.
So it began really with a guy in West London, a Polish expat called Andy Stipulkowski, and he was working for the CIA, and he started giving away books to Polish visitors who would come to his door. So when Stalin died in the mid-50s, there was a kind of liberalization in Eastern Europe, and people were allowed to travel to the West. And so pretty soon word got around in Poland that this guy was giving out free books. And he would give them 3 or 4 CIA-bought books on the understanding that they carried them back in their luggage to the Eastern Bloc. And more people showed up at his door, because people would spread word in Poland. And Andy realized that, he didn't just have to do it from his house. He could go and wherever, East Europeans were coming to the West. So
sports teams,
symphony orchestras touring, mountaineering clubs, delegations of Catholics who would come to see the Pope. Fishermen would come to Scottish fishing ports, and people would be there offering them books.
And it was CI funded, but were the book publishers in the United States supportive?
They were, yeah. I mean, whether they knew about it, if they knew what they were supporting, I don't know. I mean, I think probably they thought, all right, here's this organization who just wants to buy lots of our books. And okay, they negotiate a special rate and everything, but, we're selling books, which is a good thing, right? And but I don't suppose they sort of all knew that it was a CIA operation. And also there was a kind of don't ask, don't tell about the whole thing. So I think a lot of the Polish and East European emigre publishers, and a lot of these books were published in languages of the Eastern European countries, right? So there would be in London or Paris or Rome, there would be emigre publishing houses that were printing in their own languages, and these were being bought by the CIA. So I think among those people, a lot of people kind of suspected or might have known, but it was something you didn't really talk about because A, you didn't want to be working for the CIA, and B, you didn't want to tell anybody if that was the case. So, you know.
And there was a very famous Polish bookstore in Paris, right? And it's still there.
Yeah, I gave a talk there the other month. Yeah,
Tell us the name.
Not Shakespeare's. It's called Librairie Polonaise. It's the oldest Polish bookshop in the world because Poles have been coming to Paris, fleeing Russians for a very long time, and it's still there on Boulevard Saint-Germain. It's quite a small bookshop, but yeah, I mean, at one point in the 80s, half of its business was bought by the CIA. You know, so yeah, they were quite happy to host a talk about that.
So, tell us why George Orwell's book was so important, 1984.
Yeah, I mean, Orwell, there's a quote in the book from a British academic called Timothy Garton Ash, who used to travel around Eastern Europe all the time in the Cold War. And he said, you know, wherever I went, whichever country I went to, people would pull out their dog-eared copies of 1984 and say, how did he know? You know, how did he know what it would be like to live under this regime? And I think that's the astonishing thing about Orwell. He became the sort of poet of totalitarianism in a way. And he'd never traveled to Eastern Europe, so he'd never seen these countries firsthand, but they all could immediately relate to his vision of what they were going through. I mean, he fought in the Spanish Civil War, so he knew what communism was like, and presumably that's where he formed his impressions of it. But Orwell's books were immensely important to the CIA program. As you know, the CIA also made an animated film about Animal Farm, which some people might have seen, but he was quite useful for them in that sense.
So we don't normally think of the CIA working in an intellectual, academic aspect of giving books to other people. It's more, you know, covert military actions. So were they supportive of this during that time period? I mean, did the ranks of the CIA support this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Whoever is in the CIA in the audience, I don't want to sort of tread on your toes, but I mean, what I was told was that the CIA tended to split into, or at least the kind of overseas activities division tended to split into the kind of more paramilitary people who would come through the military usually before being recruited, and the more cerebral types who had often gone to top universities and, you know, could speak lots of languages, or particularly languages from the countries they specialized in. And there were, according to this guy, there was a sort of tension between these two groups within the organization. And his problem was that he thought the paramilitary types got all the top jobs. So when he went to his boss and said, can I have $100,000 for the Silver Age of Russian literature? The guy looked at him and said, what are you, a moron? You know, why would we want to give you $100,000 for that? And so the book program was always fighting attempts to shut it down, even though it was very cheap. You know, it probably cost something like $4 million a year in the 1980s, which, you know, in the context of the CIA spend in Afghanistan of about $800 million a year at that time is very little. But they were not, it was always kind of struggling politically within the organization. And in fact, it really owed its survival to, certainly in the Carter administration, to people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a Polish emigre himself and was Carter's national security advisor, and very much kept the book program afloat and even increased its funding. And in fact, 3 of his own books were distributed by the CIA, so, you know, that probably helped.
So there were many Eastern Bloc countries involved in this Cold War era, but it seems like the focus was in Poland. Why was Poland so important?
Well, Poland was important to the book program because Poles responded more enthusiastically than anybody else. In the early years, something like half of the letters that they got back from people in Eastern Europe were from Poles. And I think, there are lots of reasons for that. One of which is that Poland was within the context of the communist states of the Eastern Bloc. Poland always had a kind of slightly more liberal reputation. In East Germany, for instance, you had the Stasi, who were very aggressively just horrible. In the Soviet Union, you had the KGB. So, in a lot of countries, it was very difficult for dissidents to operate at all. Never mind literary-based dissidents. But in Poland, there was a slightly more liberal atmosphere, and I think Poland's history is quite democratic. They have a democratic tradition going back to the Renaissance. They thought that they were more Western-facing, I think. You mentioned Yalta. They were horrified to learn that at Yalta they'd been put in the Stalin zone. They felt betrayed by the British and the Americans. And they also had this tradition of kind of underground literature and resisting Russians that went back at least 150 years. So I think that's why. But then also the other, obviously they didn't know that at the time, but Poland was the country where communism first collapsed. It was the first domino to fall in 1989, and when it did collapse, the whole lot went after it. So, yeah.
So for me, one of the most compelling parts of the book, and the most emotional, almost hard to read, was about the underground printing presses. Mm-hmm. So can you kind of, this wasn't printing books per se, but this was now trying to print newspapers like The Guardian and things of that nature, and stories. So tell us about the underground printing presses, and I'm not going to pronounce this right, but a most heroic person in the book is Miroslav Ojecki, if I said that.
Well done.
Pretty close. So tell us about him.
So
his story is horrifying and heroic.
Yeah, Ojecki was the son of a couple of Polish war heroes. His mother had been one of the team who assassinated Nazi officers in Warsaw in the war, and was kind of widely recognized as a war hero in Poland. And Mirek was, radicalized probably as a student. He joined anti-communist demonstrations. And around about 1976, when Poland was going through a period of sort of civil unrest, anti-communist marches and so on, Ojecki joined a small opposition group called KOR, and he realized that to be an effective dissident in a country like Poland at that time, you had to be able to spread your message, and you had to be able to print stuff. And this method of spreading the word began with people just typing out, carbon copies of newsletters and so on. But as time went on, people like Ojecki turned it into a whole underground printing operation, and he managed to get hold of presses and inks and paper, all of which was incredibly tightly controlled. And he would run these print shops, which were often in some basement in the, some suburb of Warsaw, and the printers would have to dodge the secret police to get to their place of work, and then they'd spend a week locked in a kind of back room somewhere, printing a few editions of a kind of smudgy underground paper, effectively. And Ojecki was caught, and I think he was arrested 43 times. and he would be beaten up by the Polish equivalent of the KGB, tortured, but he was just a fantastically courageous young man, and he kept doing it. And if they would release him, he would go away and organise some more printing, and then they'd arrest him again, and it was in and out of jail. And then eventually, in 1981, he was in one of these periods of liberalisation in Poland. He was allowed to travel, and he went to the West, and ended up in Washington D.C. meeting some of the kind of Polish expats who were quite high up in the National Security Council and quite in with the security establishment in Washington. And as he was in DC, martial law was declared in Poland, which was basically this operation to round up all the Solidarity dissidents and throw them in jail. And Chojecki was sort of caught outside the country, so he was forced into exile, effectively. And he decided to become, he became Solidarity's Minister of Smuggling. That was what they called him. And his job was to get printing equipment and books and all the paraphernalia the underground in Poland needed to get that through the Iron Curtain. So he became a sort of logistics expert, running all these kind of rat lines into Poland from Paris, which is where he was based. And, just shortly after martial law was declared, when he was in DC, he had a dinner in a suburb of DC, which is where a lot of the CIA live, it turns out. And the head of the CIA, Bill Casey, came to dinner with him, along with Brzezinski and all the other kind of high-ups in the National Security Council. So from that moment on, really, he was a kind of CIA asset, if you like, supplying Poland.
And the risks that these individuals, both men and women, faced, were arrest without any due process and really without any trial, torture. In fact, he was tortured at one time and went on a hunger strike. And you talked about that prison, I think it's Mokotów,
yeah.
Where you said that after the Cold War, they found hundreds of skeletons buried, right, with bullet holes in the back of their head, people that lost their lives because of what was going on. But tell us a little bit about his experience with being tortured and force-fed, because it was just so emotional.
Yeah, he was picked up on some spurious charge. This was his 43rd arrest, he told me. And
you talked to him?
Yeah, and sadly he died about 3 months ago. But the book is, he's very much the central figure in the book, and I spend a lot of time with him in Warsaw. And I found him very impressive guy. So he'd been arrested and was put in this, it's the Polish equivalent of the Lubyanka. It's like it's the Interior Ministry's prison of choice, where they put people. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, they were breaking people's arms and shooting them in the back of the head there. But in the 80s, it had become a little bit less sort of, I suppose, murderous. But it was still a horrible place to be. And they never told him what charges he was on. The power of the totalitarian state is really to make you feel like you have no power at all, and you don't. So they don't even tell you what you're arrested for, and you can't see a lawyer. He wasn't allowed access to any books that might tell him what bit of the penal code he was arrested under, and so on. So he went on hunger strike, and then ended up being force-fed, which is really the most grotesque bit of the experience, I think, for him. Someone would come into his cell and they'd shove this rubber hose down his throat and a funnel and pour in this kind of substance he called a kind of fatty mush. And then he was sick often after it, even though he was being force-fed. And he just, he slowly, his eyesight sort of stopped working, and he lost enormous amounts of weight.
But he had his wits about him because he wrote notes, and
he still managed to kind of scribble on bits of paper, which he somehow
and he was able to eventually smuggle those out and have them.
Yeah, and then he wrote up this story and then got it printed in the underground press, which is the kind of character he was.
So I want you to read another passage.
Yes.
It's on 95 to 96. It's kind of the description of what happened after martial law was declared in the mid-1980s.
Okay. The junta was suspending solidarity, banning all strikes and political gatherings, and introducing a curfew from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was forbidden for anyone over 13 to leave home without ID papers. Anyone over 16 and under 60 could be conscripted to work for free for the purposes of national defense. All gasoline belonged to the state, so private vehicles were effectively banned. A long list of misdemeanors could be met with a punishment up to and including the death penalty. Military commissars took control of key enterprises and institutions, including the railways, the roads, the media, telecoms, fuel distribution, the ports, energy companies, and fire brigades. Employees of these militarized companies were subject to military law, which meant workers who failed to obey orders could be sentenced to death. The working week was extended from 6 to 6 days from the 5 Solidarity had negotiated, and the junta reserved the right to make it 7. A shift could last 12 hours, and annual leave was cut to 12 days. That probably doesn't sound too little in America, does it? The male censors were given new powers, and Polish media was restricted to 1 television channel, 1 radio station, and 2 newspapers, namely the party's own People's Tribune and the Army's Soldier of Freedom. The crackdown particularly targeted the independent press. Censorship was to return to strict pre-1980 levels. Printing equipment was exclusively to be used by state-run institutions and then only with written permission. Anyone who disseminated news that fit the broad definition of weakening the defense preparedness of the Polish People's Republic would be subject to a jail term of 1 to 8 years. Anyone who spread news that could cause a public disturbance faced between 6 months and 5 years. Anyone who prepared, collected, stored, transported, transferred, or transmitted a piece of writing, printed matter, recording, or a film containing any such information could also receive up to 5 years, and anyone who printed would be jailed for up to 10 years.
So eventually they couldn't sustain their economies. And it started to lead to turmoil. You had strikes, you had Solidarity, which we all heard of back then, and you had Lech Wałęsa, who we saw on television. And eventually it led to a collapse. So what role do you think the CI Book Club played in that, the eventual collapse?
Yeah, well, this is sort of the nub of the story, I suppose, is how significant, how important it was. And I think the fact that, very few people have heard of this operation has meant that it's really quite overlooked. But if you talk to people in Poland who were in Solidarity in that period, and as I've said, Poland was really the crucial country for this program and also for the collapse of communism. So if you talk to that Solidarity era of dissidents, they will almost all have read these books. A lot of them were brought up on them politically, so they would go to university, they would meet people who would have access to some of these books. And there were, whole libraries of these books were circulating behind the Iron Curtain. And they would get, their first inkling that there was another system because they'd been brought up in the, their schools had taught them from kindergarten that there was only one way of doing things, and it was the Soviet way. And these books showed them that there was a kind of another way of thinking, another ideology, another system, and they weren't. By the way, the books weren't all kind of Orwell and political tracts. Some of them were. There were copies of Marie Claire magazine or Life magazine, and Poles would say to me things like, "Yeah, so you see a picture of a beachfront condo in Life magazine with a swimming pool, and you live in a concrete tower block with a tiny apartment, and you have to wait 20 years to get on the housing list so you can move out of your parents' place." The kind of propaganda value of that juxtaposition was a very powerful effect. But, the books had in themselves, they had this kind of intrinsic message. But they also, because they were shared between groups of kind of like-minded people, they also had the effect of bringing groups of dissidents together. So they created these little cells who then went on to kind of found solidarity and then overturn communism in the end. And I had an interview with a guy called Adam Michnik, who's like a big Solidarity era dissident, a big intellectual of Solidarity, who said, yeah, we should build a monument to books because it was books that were victorious in the fight. So he clearly thought that literature was the thing that overturned communism in the Eastern Bloc.
So in the last couple minutes, I have two things I want you to do. I want to finish with the reading, but it's an incredible, compelling, factual story about a time period in history. But are there lessons you think we should take away as readers from this book?
No.
I told you, we gave a preview at the beginning so you'd stay.
Well, I think it's fairly obvious, isn't it? One, I think that censorship doesn't really work, and it creates a giant problem, and it creates more appetite for the thing that's censored. I mean, there's this, you probably all know it in this audience, this thing called the Barbara Streisand effect, where I think she tried to stop a video of her house being disseminated, and only about 6 people had watched this film. But once she sued, millions of people wanted to watch it. So I think there's that lesson, but also the lesson that we live in this kind of era of new waves of censorship and propaganda. It's very different in a way in that we're bombarded with too much information and we don't know what's true. Whereas back then, in the Eastern Bloc, there wasn't much information, and it was a question of kind of penetrating the firewall, if you like. Now we're just drowning in, I won't say the word, in bad stuff. And I think, in this country, there's been quite a lot of censorship recently too. I did a little bit of looking into it about 6 months ago, and was looking at these book bans in schools, and in fact some of the same books that the CIA was sending to the Eastern Bloc have been banned in American schools, which seems to me really ironic.
So we just have a short time left. Can I get you to read the last part?
You can. I've got 28 seconds.
Well, I'm the judge.
Can I show them this as well?
Sure.
You are the judge.
I am the judge, but go ahead.
Yeah. This is I just wanted to mention this, which I forgot. This is a miniature. So at some point they started printing these tiny little copies of books. And the idea of these was that you could, they got canning equipment for, the things you put baked beans into tins with. And you could fit 4 or 5 of these in a baked bean tin, and then put it on a humanitarian truck and send it into Poland or wherever. And then the person on the other end would open their baked beans and get these, which they weren't always very happy about. But right, here we go. 281. The most valuable assessments of the program may come from the people most directly affected, the Poles who were sustained by it. For Joanna Szczęsna, part of the job of uncensored literature was to give Poles access to information they were not allowed to have about suppressed aspects of their history. We didn't want to accept that somebody is going to tell us how we should see everything, she said, but that was only part of the picture. Literature also nourished the soul and gave them a sense of a broader human context. Books gave us the tools to understand the world, she said. We read poetry and literature. It showed us that there are like-minded people who are above nationality, who we can empathize with, who admire beauty, who admire virtue. Adam Michnik, who spent so much time in jail, found literature a compass by which to live. It gave him a perspective and values, he said. It allowed you to look at and assess your own country's history from a contemporary point of view, and you could feel after reading a book that your spine would be straightening up, and you knew then that you could tell the state no, and I still know that today. Victor Kolarski, for so many years, Bujak's deputy in the Warsaw Underground, would compare the printing machines they received in the aftermath of Jaruzelski's crackdown to weapons. The importance of the press cannot be overemphasized, he has said. The printing presses we got from the West during martial law might be compared to machine guns or tanks during war. Perhaps the highest tribute to the book program came from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who after moving to the United States became a distributor of ILC, that's International Literary Center, books himself. When Minden retired, the great author thanked him personally in a copy of his book, The Red Wheel. To George Minden, with gratitude, he wrote, signing it Sasha. This book is now in the possession of Minden's sons. I think George and Solzhenitsyn were on a shared mission, said John Minden, to make the world a better place. Thank you.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
What a better place than a library to talk about the book club.
Thank you. Thank you, JB.
In '65, I was in Poland.